which is content analysis. Now, there's often confusion linguistically in that you can analyze text, you can analyze content, and that can be done in any way, narrative or visual, or, and this is when we get to the method of content analysis. So where it says content analysis, you're referring to a specific method as opposed to analysis of content or analysis of texts, where you could be open to a wide variety of methods. So often confused, it's slightly annoying language, but there we are. Content analysis is a specific analytical approach, and the simplest way of remembering it is it usually involves counting things within the content. So I'm going to talk about what is content analysis, why it's useful, and how you do it, developing coding systems. I'm going to talk you through validity and reliability measures, piloting, code books, and then I'll talk about the limitations of content analysis. And I'll do some exercises with you along the way. Something I recorded for students last year was a simple exercise of, I have come in with a bag of my shopping. Can you count how many items of fruit I have? And I got people to vote on how confident they were that they'd know how many items of fruit there were once I took out the items, and to think about what would you need to know before you started counting, taking out the items of fruit in my bag and knowing how to count them. So it seems like a simple exercise, but keep that in your mind as we learn some of these techniques, because it's not always as simple as it looks. Okay, so content analysis is an approach used in analysing text to count. For example, how often something is reported in a particular way. And I've got a couple of definitions of content analysis here. A research technique for the objective, systematic, and quantitative description of the manifest content of communication, so the surface content of it. And look at those terms, objective, systematic, and quantitative. And another definition is the systematic assignment of communication content to categories according to rules, and the analysis of relationships involving those categories using statistical methods. So again, counting. So here's an example of something you can see used content analysis. This is an article in Journalism and Mass Communication Quarterly, and it found that in 1971, 6.3% of all articles used content analysis, and in 1995, 34.8% of all articles used content analysis. And that's displaying two things. One, it's displaying that there was an increase in the popularity of content analysis when you compare 71 to 95, but it is also in itself a content analysis. They've done an analysis of how often that method of content analysis appeared in the journal articles. So it's very popular, it's very convenient, and it can be very powerful. Roughly how many of you are currently, you've thought of your research questions, how many of you at the moment are thinking you might be doing a content analysis? Just a show of hands. Okay, again, about half of you look like you might be using it. So for those of you who are thinking you won't be using it, it's important to know why you won't, what its strengths and weaknesses were, and how it compares to the method you have chosen, and therefore you know what questions you can't answer. So I always say to people, don't just focus in on the method you are going to use, but at least be aware of the strengths and weaknesses of other methods. So content analysis on its own, it's really kind of cheap and convenient. For a start, there isn't that need for human subjects and a lot of the ethical negotiation, not to mention administrative negotiation of working with human subjects. And it's a good way of systematically studying large samples of media content. And it allows the researcher to make comparisons. So you can make comparisons between different newspapers or over time. And repeated media content matters. So, for example, do parties receive the same amount or type of airtime? You can look at how the Labour Party is reported versus the Conservative Party, how Wales is reported versus England, or how the Daily Mail reports something versus the Times. All of those can be done with qualitative methods, but they can also usefully be done and sometimes more powerfully using content analysis. And it's a useful starting point for exploring potential media influence on people's understanding of social or political issues. And you notice how cautiously, I'm not doing an effects study there, I'm talking about looking at patterns in media reporting as a starting point for exploring potential media influence. And it is indeed a very popular method for undergraduate dissertations. It depends how confident you feel as well in some of your other forms of analysis. So it can be versatile for different types of research question. And looking at what is there in content, and I keep using the word manifest because it tends to be kind of the surface content, whereas when you're doing a semiotic analysis or a visual analysis, you might delve deeply and extrapolate about lighting or whatever. The content analysis tends to be more looking at the kind of clear, indisputable surface meanings. So content can look at how is content featured, how much, what's the volume of news coverage, and what are the patterns. For example, in what publications does the coverage of this particular story feature, what genre of news issues are represented, what terminology or other textual features regularly appear, or indeed don't appear, and how certain ideas are linked. So this is some research that my colleague Dr. Kerry Moore did on Islamophobia. And she and her colleagues looked at a content analysis of UK press between 2000 and 2008. So with any content analysis, you start by defining what kind of sample are you looking at, and she's signalled here UK press between these dates. And her research focus was a concern that Islamophobia was being perpetuated by British news media, and you can find a link to the actual report. If this is something you want to follow up, the link is here on the slide, and the slides, of course, are under learning materials. But the kind of data that's in that report is the classic data you expect from content analysis, graphs, for example. And when you're doing content analysis, you need to handle graph software, and you need to know how to represent numbers, both in tables and also in visual ways that meaningfully convey the outcome of your findings. So here you can see she's talked about the volume of stories on Islam in the news media, and showed a huge increase from 2000, peaking in this case in 2006. So that's simply the volume of coverage. And then the other thing she looked at here is news hooks. What did the journalists say had caused them to write this story at this moment in time? And the blue line at the top there, this is the bottom right-hand graph, is terrorism was seen as the prompt, and you can see a huge peak in 2002. But you can also see how that was overtaken by addressing broader religious cultural issues, and how little attention was given to violence and attack against Muslims, how little attention was given to Islamophobia itself and its expression through violent attack. And if anything, that's what it has. It's gone down over time. So, what are the steps involved in a content analysis? You're already halfway there if you've decided on your topic of interest and you have an idea of why it's interesting. And then there are these other steps. Your data collection. How are you going to do that? What's the database you might use, or the archive? Decide on what to count. What's your unit of analysis, your units of measurement? And then you define those categories and you develop a coding scheme, and we'll spend a lot of time on that today. You need to check your coding is consistent. You often develop a code book, and you start coding then from start to finish. Once you've started, you can't change your coding frame. Or if you do, you have to go right back to the beginning and change it all. And sometimes people kind of worry that you may kind of introduce some bias. So the idea is that you've done piloting enough that you have a clear sense of here's my coding frame, this is what I'm counting, and I'll systematically read each newspaper article, for example, and find out how often X, Y, or Z is present. And you need to do a check on reliability, which can be either coding between perhaps two people and you can help each other out. You can each do a bit of each other's coding if you're involved in content analysis, or you can check your own coding later at a different point in time. So does anyone want to just volunteer who's thinking of doing content analysis, what your topic of interest, what your area is, and how you think you're going to collect your data? Yeah? I'm really sorry. Can you project your voice really powerfully?
I was going to be looking at what business and hip hop, so I wanted to do lyrical content analysis. So I wanted to take the top 5 artists in 5 years back and see how they make their lyrics relate to artists.
Right. So the content analysis of lyrics of hip hop. Great. And you've got a long time period there. Have you an idea of how many sets of lyrics you'll have? Yeah. Okay. So, but no, that sounds a classic thing that you might do a content analysis of. But notice how immediately there's a time span. And an idea of change within that time span, or not necessarily? No. Okay. And so quantity is often an issue. With content analysis, you're talking numbers and you're talking quantity. And ideally, such that your numbers can allow you to make kind of statistical claims at the end. There's no point doing a content analysis where we're only looking at 3 articles. And that would be where you're doing a much more semiotic, qualitative analysis. And there's often some idea of comparison. So, is this year different from 10 years ago? Or is this newspaper coverage different from that newspaper coverage? Or is the attention to this kind of violence a lot more than attention to that kind of violence? Or is attention to white-collar crime much less common than attention to blue-collar crime? So those are the sorts of things. You don't have to have a comparison, but people often do. So, think about why you are studying media content, and you don't want to just describe, you want to be analysing, measuring, identifying features for a purpose, looking for patterns because you think they demonstrate something significant or contribute to a bigger picture about a certain issue. So you've already got ideas, theories, questions that inform your development of your content analysis. Otherwise, all you're doing is taking like a huge pile of newspaper articles and turning them into a set of tables without particular meaning that simply display some quantitative element. So, your data collection, you need to think about how you're going to get your text for content analysis. How do you get lyrics from all that time back? Can you access them? How are you going to get your newspapers? If you're interested in some historical newspapers, can you access the archive? Or the vlogs, or film, or other? So your data collection is one key thing you're going to be thinking about, and this is true across all the methods we're discussing. So when you get to writing assessment 2, we're going to want to know how you're collecting the data you're going to analyse, whatever method you choose to use to analyse it. So what's important is identifying the population, the sampling frame, and the sample. So in images of Islam, for example, attention was paid to all British national newspaper articles since 2000 mentioning Islam, Muslims in Britain, and all British national newspaper articles mentioning Islam, Muslims in the even years since 2000. So you can subsample. You can say, you know what, I'm only going to look at 2002, 2004, 2006, or odd numbers. Because sometimes you just have to reduce the sample because it becomes overwhelming, but you still want the time span. So you've got various choices there. You could either go, well, I'm going to only do it on the last 3 years, but you might then miss out significant changes that have happened across the last 10. So instead you might just do alternate years. You can also do things like, as they did in this case, a 10% stratified random sample proportionate to the total volume of coverage in English newspapers. So that's about looking at, well, there was a huge amount of coverage of Muslims in Britain in the Daily Mail, but not so much in the Times. So rather than treat that, then try and take 10% of the whole sample, you might want 10% of the articles in the Daily Mail and 10% of the articles in the Times, and so forth. So you have to be thoughtful about what the overall sample is. And this strategy ended up giving this particular project just under 1,000 articles, but still allows them to say something about a range of newspapers over a range of time. So then you need to think about what you're going to count. So content analysis is about comparing comparable bits of text or units of analysis. Newspaper articles, paragraphs, headlines, front pages, TV programs, slots of time. And you cannot compare unequal bits of text, so you need to think about what size of text makes the most sense. What I'll be doing later on in this lecture is actually giving you 2 little guest lectures from colleagues who've talked through their project. And if some of you are struggling with keeping up with this in the abstract, you'll probably find it a lot easier to make sense of some of what I'm saying when you've had those mini guest lectures from colleagues about how they use content analysis on their project. So to develop a coding frame, you need to think about what units of measurement or variables are to be included, and in other words, what questions you are asking of the text. So you can ask what I might call demographic types of questions, like the location of coverage, the gender of the author, or possibly where an item of text is positioned. Is it on the front page, the back page, the women's page, the sports page? And that can be standard almost regardless of your topic. And then you move on to questions about the phenomena in which you're interested in. So a standard coding sheet will often go, who's the journalist? What date was it? Which newspaper was it in? I'll default to newspapers, but for those of you working on other formats, just substitute whatever's right for your format here. But the lyrics would be who wrote the lyrics, when were the lyrics written, maybe who picked up and who sang those lyrics, and for a film or a series of films, it might be who was the producer of the film, when was it produced, what was the studio, which ones are Hollywood, which ones aren't, which ones are Bollywood. So those questions slightly vary depending on what you're studying. And then you need to get into questions about the phenomena in which you're interested in. And this is where it becomes specific to what you're looking at. So it might look at the people mentioned, and that's going to be vary depending on your topic. What are the main themes? What are the news hooks? Who are the sources? How are things labelled? What kind of things are associated? So those are generic representations of actually what will become quite specific, topic-specific coding units. And again, as we get to specifics, I think you might find that easier. Now we're going to watch a bit of a Tom and Jerry cartoon. So Tom and Jerry cartoons are interesting because people are always interested, or used to be very interested in, whether they were too violent. And so if you were going to ask of a Tom and Jerry cartoon, well, how much violence is there? How might you categorize the violence? You might want to differentiate between whether the violence was initiated by Tom or Jerry. You could indeed count how many acts of violence are there, and you might want to look at how many different types of weapons are used. But if you just watch and attempt to count without an operational definition, you and others may come up with very different numbers. So I now want you to watch this and work out how many acts of violence you think there were and how many different types of weapon were used. So you're doing a bit of instant content analysis.